All I can do is ask the question. My people came to me, Dan Coates came to me, and some others. They said they think it's Russia. I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this. I don't see any reason why it would be.
It is a first for an American president. President Trump igniting a firestorm after meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin today for a summit in Helsinki, Finland. His remarks causing outrage amongst fellow Republicans after he failed to hold Putin accountable for interfering in the 2016 U.S. elections.
Eyewitness News reporter Adi Guajardo spoke with a local Republican speaking out against his own party. Adi?
Republican Congressman Hurd is just one of many lawmakers speaking out in a heated discussion that now has a Republican Party divided. Many took to Twitter tweeting that there is no question if Russia interfered with the U.S. elections. Hurd even calling Putin a thug.
President Trump facing harsh criticism from his fellow Republicans after siding with President Vladimir Putin, who insists he didn't meddle in the U.S. elections.
I have great confidence in my intelligence people. But I will tell you that President Putin was extremely strong and powerful in his denial today.
Republican Hurd, a former CIA agent, was quick to set the record straight.
It's very clear who was involved in doing the hacking. It was Russian intelligence, period, end of story. The entire intelligence community believes that.
Senator John Cornyn tweeting false next to a Washington Examiner article that quoted Putin saying he never interfered with U.S. internal affairs. Several lawmakers adding that the president missed an opportunity to hold Russia accountable.
To talk tough and to show that we're serious about this. This was a missed opportunity as well to show our allies that are dealing with this Russian threat every single day that we have their backs.
Many criticized Mr. Trump for not defending U.S. intelligence agencies.
I just felt like the president's comments made us look as a nation more like a pushover.
Just last week, 12 Russian nationalists were indicted in connection with Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation, accused of hacking Democrat emails and computer networks.
All I can speculate is that there is an effort underway to sort of figure out if by being nice to Vladimir Putin, there is a way that we can establish a better working relationship.
During the summit, President Trump called the Russian probe a disaster for the country.
And tonight, many Republicans are making it clear, stating that Russia is not an ally to the U.S. Yet, President Trump says Putin is ready to help in Mueller's investigation. Reporting from the studio, Adi Guajardo, KENS 5, Eyewitness News.